Shadows and Seeds, Munich, June 1942. Beneath the battered rooftops of wartime Munich, the air shivered with rumors and dread. The city, so long the heart of the Nazi movement, now bore the silent weight of fear and conformity. But in the bustling halls of Ludwig Maximilian University, a quiet rebellion germinated. In a dim-lit student apartment, Sophie Scholl traced her fingers over forbidden words penned by her brother, Hans, freedom and honor. Here, far from Berlin's iron grip, the seeds of the White Rose took root. Sophie, 19, with eyes blazing a gentle, stubborn fire, had never believed the official lies. Raised in a family that prized conscience above obedience, she watched friends vanish into the maw of war, saw neighbors cowed by propaganda, and felt a scalding outrage at reports of vanished Jews, broken teachers, and the stench of hate. Hans, older by 3 years, himself a former Nazi youth member now bitterly disillusioned, had seen too much of war's brutality in medical service on the Eastern Front. Returned from Russia with unspeakable memories, Hans carried pamphlets hidden in textbooks, his words spilled rebellion onto clandestine sheets, their typewriter clacks masked by jazz music married to danger. One night in June, Sophie joined Hans, Christoph Probst, Alexander Schmorl, and Willy Graf in a smoky apartment. Images haunted them, the mass shootings in Ukraine, the battered corpses under icy trees, horrors scrawled on secret flyers. Their hands shook as they typed, "Is this the face of Germany? Or only its shame?" Each leaflet demanded an awakening. Each night, they whispered of conscience, risking death for the word's sake. Their circle was small yet fierce, defiant in the heart of the beast, resolved to break the silence. Across Germany, hope flickered like a fleeting firefly, if only someone dared to let it shine. The first leaflets, Whispers on the Wind. On June 27, 1942, Sophie watched her brother seal envelopes, hands trembling. The first White Rose leaflets were ready, the text indicting Hitler's heinous crimes, calling on Germans not to be complicit in evil. Their message, meticulously crafted, denounced the Führer's warmongering and challenged citizens, "We will not be silent. We are your guilty conscience." That night, Sophie knew every sidewalk and mailbox they touched bore moral risk. Under cover of darkness, Hans and Alexander darted through Munich streets, faces shadowed by lamplight, dropping copies near university doors. Some pamphlets found their way to mailboxes in Augsburg, Stuttgart, and even Vienna, sent by trusted allies beyond Munich. Their distribution network was perilous but ingenious, relying on students' courage and secrecy. Sophie's role was no less vital. She procured paper, ink, and addresses, always vigilant for Gestapo eyes. Germany's cities lay blanketed in fearful silence, yet the White Rose brought whispers to the wind. Each leaflet carried devastating truths: mass executions, burning villages, the crushing of Poland, the genocide now known only in rumor and horror. Sophie read replies from shaken students. One feared for his family, another asked for more. The leaflets multiplied like seeds cast by desperate hands. Their risk grew hourly. The Gestapo, relentless and methodical, sniffed out foreign words, surveilled postal routes, interrogated suspected subversives. The Scholl home was watched. Hans's medical friends lived in tension. But courage breeds courage. As June turned to July, even Sophie, usually reserved, began urging friends to join. Their movement, anonymous but burning, was now a gathering storm. Echoes from the east, a conscience awakens. The brutality in Russia cascaded through White Rose's leaflets. Alexander Schmorl, born in Russia and fluent in its agony, wrote vivid passages to prick German hearts. Summer 1942 saw the Nazi war machine grinding deeper into the Soviet Union. News of mass deportations, ghetto liquidations, and summary executions trickled back in horrific detail to the Scholls. One leaflet whispered, "What does your flag conceal? The murder of innocent men, women, and children." Sophie's outrage boiled over. She grieved for the Russian children whose faces haunted Alexander's nightmares, for entire villages erased at a general's whim. In secret meetings, she lobbied to make their protest sharper, to cry out not just against war, but against genocide and tyranny's machinery. Their courage infected new members. Willy Graf, whose brother had perished at the front, joined, bringing passion born of loss. Sophie gathered evidence from soldiers returning on leave, stories of gas trucks, mass pits outside Smolensk, and burned synagogues. Their new pamphlets drew upon facts and names: Stalingrad's bombing, the slaughter in Berdichev, the fate of Jews in Cologne, forcing awake the numbed conscience of an indoctrinated nation. By September, Sophie's writing rivaled even Hans's. Her voice rang clear in pamphlets: "Who among us will dare to make this horror end?" The White Rose was no longer a murmur. Copies left at university halls, slipped under dormitory doors, spread ripples through the student body. Even as the Gestapo arrested dissidents citywide, their circle grew more audacious, more desperate. Each leaflet became a ticking clock, the moment before betrayal, before execution. A web spirals outward, autumn into danger. As Munich's maple leaves fell in October 1942, the White Rose cast its net farther. Hans traveled quietly to Ulm, Sophie to Stuttgart for clandestine meetings. Their leaflets now went by train. Trusted allies carried stacks to Leipzig and Hamburg, some even crossing the Rhine. Risk abounded. The Gestapo redoubled efforts after intercepted correspondence in Berlin led to arrests. Yet courage scaled with peril. Steadfast professors like Kurt Huber joined, his lectures coated with philosophical resistance, his presence bestowing gravitas even as family dissuaded him, warning of Nazi retribution. Some older scholars counseled caution. The students brushed aside fears, desperate for impact. Sophie argued, "What is life without truth?" Her conviction unyielding, her resolve infecting even the hesitant. Sophisticated printing presses replaced makeshift methods. Paper shortages forced the group to improvise. Ink was bartered in secret. Their leaflets, now hundreds per run, bore ever clearer indictments: the regime is criminal. It kills for greed and ambition. Sophie's unique style, gentle but fierce, mixed with Hans's implacable rhetoric. Their literature seeped into subversive circles, beginning to alarm university authorities. Tensions mounted, every step dogged by fear. Friends outside the core group grew uneasy with increased risk. Gestapo surveillance intensified. Shadowy men loitered near Sophie's lectures, Hans's walk home. Mutters in the university halls, rumors of arrests, heightened paranoia. But Sophie rallied all: "We must not fail. If we do not resist, who will?" The web of resistance spiraled outward. Their leaflets challenged the continent. Sophie's heart pounded with hope and dread, no turning back. Turning point, a new year, a daring gambit. January 1943 brought snowdrifts to Munich and a fever of both fear and resolve to the White Rose. Sophie, her face more gaunt but unbowed, saw evidence that their words began to matter. Hints of unrest grew across campus. Pamphlets appeared in more cities, sometimes provoking bold discussions in cafes and quiet, frightened debates in university corridors. Gestapo threats turned more direct. Posters warned, traitors will be punished, and students vanished overnight. Sophie's hands shook when she read the news: acquaintances arrested in Leipzig, a former classmate beaten in Berlin. Despite danger, the resistance surged. Hans proposed a new gambit, a sixth leaflet, more daring, clearer still. It would call for mass sabotage, for students to rise and protest: "We will not rest until tyranny falls." In fevered night meetings, the group planned an audacious distribution within university walls. Sophie, determined, insisted she join Hans for the mission. "It is my duty." The plan was set. Pamphlets would be left throughout lecture halls and stairwells during broad daylight, a reckless, high-stakes move. Printing presses whirred under firelight. The group wrote with sharpest urgency, knowing Gestapo agents prowled nearby. Sophie packed her school bag with leaflets. Hans rehearsed their route. Dread shadowed every heartbeat. They would act on February 18, 1943, at the university's busiest hour. Their aim: awaken hundreds, maybe thousands. The die was cast. Hope and danger knotted in Sophie's breast. The White Rose was set to bloom at its brightest, at greatest peril. Day of Reckoning, February 18, 1943. The winter morning broke leaden and uncertain, sunlight barely prying apart the veils of fog clinging to Munich streets. Sophie and Hans Scholl, dressed plainly, leaflets bundled in Sophie's brown suitcase, cut figures of deliberate calm as they threaded through the city toward Ludwig Maximilian University. Every step felt like trespass, each glance over their shoulders, a summons to fate. The White Rose's moment of courage, and perhaps its undoing, had come. At 11 a.m., the university pulsed with students shuffling between lectures. Sophie's heart thudded as she slipped pamphlets onto wide marble windowsills, into the crevices of radiators, between stacks of books in the library. Hans moved with grim determination, scattering leaflets up and down deserted corridors where students would find and read them. They did not speak, not daring to betray themselves with a whisper. Then, atop the grand staircase above the central atrium, Sophie hesitated, a vision of liberty suddenly vivid in her mind. Defiant, she seized the last of the leaflets and tipped them over the balustrade, letting the papers flutter down like a silent snow of protest into the foyer below. The moment was breathtaking, 1,000 words falling for freedom in the heart of the Reich. But fate saw all. Janitor Jacob Schmid, a party loyalist, witnessed the act. Within minutes, university security sealed exits and called the Gestapo. Sophie and Hans were stopped, their bags searched. Each heartbeat thundered as the inevitable descended, pamphlets in hand, White Rose members in custody. As they were removed from campus, the pamphlets they scattered became the last breath of student hope before the iron doors slammed shut. In the lion's den, interrogation and resistance. Drained and dazed, Sophie and Hans were swept to Gestapo headquarters at Wittelsbacher Palais, the heart of darkness in Nazi Munich. They faced investigator Robert Moore, a seasoned interrogator with cold, clinical eyes. The Scholls, exhausted and hungry, gripped each other's hands before being separated for questioning. Moore, suspecting simple student mischief, pressed them to admit to distributing anti-government material. Sophie's resolve was battered but not broken. "You have me," she answered, voice calm, eyes unafraid. "I stand by my actions." Hans, likewise, tried to shield his friends and refused to implicate others, though incriminating evidence, drafts of pamphlets, addresses, and a handwritten note linking to Christoph Probst, were found on his person. The situation was dire. One careless word would doom the entire network. The Gestapo ramped up pressure, threatening Sophie with execution, with suffering for her family, all designed to break the steel of her conscience. She did not cry, she did not waver. Surprised, Moore found himself almost respecting her audacity. "So young, and yet so sure," he muttered. But the Nazis had no interest in respect, only in breaking what they could not control. By the second day, Probst was arrested, betraying desperation and fear. Hans and Sophie braced for the inevitable. Sophie burned confession fragments in her cell's tiny basin, staring at the sooty water. She prayed for the courage to endure, for herself and her loved ones. The interrogations dragged on for days. Outside, the world spun, unknowing. Inside, the fate of student resistance hung by a fraying thread. The People's Court, guillotine sentence. On February 22, 1943, in just 4 days, the Nazi regime hustled Sophie, Hans, and Christoph Probst before the relentless judge Roland Freisler and the so-called People's Court. The proceedings were a performance of terror, the outcome predetermined. Freisler's shrill invectives echoed through the courtroom: "You have betrayed the fatherland. You incite rebellion at a time of war, death is your only reward." Sophie, pale but upright, stared through Freisler's venom with serene contempt. Denied real defense, the three resisted blame. Sophie insisted, "What we wrote, many think, they are just afraid to say it aloud." She addressed the court, not with remorse, but with pride: "We will carry this burden, so our people may one day be free." The trial was a spectacle, public, ruthless, a warning to all. Freisler's gavel was a weapon. Within hours, the verdict thundered: guilty. Sentenced to death by guillotine. No appeals. No delay. The execution was ordered for that very afternoon. Their parents arrived, grief-stricken. Sophie hugged her mother with trembling arms, reassuring her that she was at peace. "After all, such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go." But what I have done, I did for my country's good. All Munich seemed shuddered in fear, while, across campus, news of the arrests sent shudders through every lecture hall. Resistance, it seemed, had met its end. Yet the world would not remain deaf. Seeds had been planted, and visible and deep. A final hour, the last light. In Stadelheim prison, the condemned trio awaited the blade. The chaplain visited, offering solace. Sophie asked for only a moment to write to her loved ones. Her letter was brief, full of love and forgiveness, hope steady even as the shadow of death descended over her slim figure. Probst, youngest and a father of 3, wept openly. Hans gripped his hand. Through the cell bars, Sophie smiled, radiant, carrying the calm of conviction. Just after 5 o'clock, the guards fetched them. Hans went first, his last words ringing with defiance, "Long live freedom." Sophie followed, slight and steady, hair brushed back. The prison corridor echoed with footfalls and history's judgment. The guillotine, efficient, merciless, ended their lives in minutes. Within an hour, their world was gone, but their voices were not. Prisoners spoke of Sophie's courage, her serenity in facing death. Outside, the dust deepened over Munich. The White Rose was severed, yet blood had washed their protest into legend. Gestapo kept their deaths hidden, but others noticed. Guards, clerks, fellow prisoners whispered of Sophie, the girl who had looked death in the eyes without flinching. Even in defeat, the White Rose glimmered, a memory, a prophecy. Threads of light, the underground blooms. The Third Reich celebrated its victory over traitors, posting grim bulletins urging students to remember their duty. Yet beneath the veneer of Nazi triumph, subtle shifts shivered the fabric of German society. The day after the execution, White Rose leaflets found their way along student corridors, from carbon copies hidden by secret sympathizers, to handwritten quotations slipped inside textbooks and pasted to dormitory doors. Some, horrified by the executions, found quiet ways to resist, sabotaged equipment, false reports, even more secret pamphlets. Unknown to the authorities, the last White Rose leaflet, a copy smuggled out by Allied intelligence, was dropped in millions over Germany from British aircraft, broadcasting Sophie's final call. Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition. White Rose's legacy ignited quiet embers in cities under the Nazi fist, Berlin, Hamburg, Leipzig, where new voices, inspired by Sophie Scholl's memory, dared to speak and act. Their names would not be known for years, but the pattern held: wherever tyranny grows, conscience finds a way to answer. The Nazi intent was erasure, Sophie's intention was awakening. In that contest, the seed she planted would outgrow every prison wall. Aftermath and shockwaves, February-March 1943. The execution of Sophie, Hans, and Christoph shocked even hardened members of the Nazi bureaucracy. In Munich, Ludwig Maximilian University's terrified faculty hurriedly distanced themselves, but behind closed doors, some sank into quiet grief or shame. Professors whispered that the Scholls had shown what a free German ought to look like, though few dared voice such thoughts openly. Desks where Hans and Sophie had once sat were left unoccupied, flowers appearing silently overnight, gentle rebellions that no Gestapo search could erase. Meanwhile, the Gestapo commenced a sweeping crackdown. Willy Graf, Alexander Schmorl, Professor Kurt Huber, and other suspected collaborators were tracked, arrested, and subjected to weeks of nightly interrogations. Many university students were placed under suspicion, their friendships and loyalties picked apart by relentless secret police. In the hush of campus, stories trickled out: Sophie's refusal to betray a single soul in her final hours, Hans's unwavering posture before his accusers, Probst's desperate yearning to see his family one last time. These were stories that lingered, making the White Rose not a warning, but a legend. The regime rewarded informants lavishly. Janitor Jacob Schmid received a state award and a cash prize, his name immortalized as the savior of German youth. But the city's collective heart shivered with another legacy, the indelible memory of courage. Each day, more students paused to look at the empty desks, to recall the echoes of words scattered once like rebellious leaves into a winter wind. The net tightens, pursuing remnants. Even as the world reeled from the surrender at Stalingrad and bombers swarmed German skies, the Reich turned a merciless eye toward unfinished business, the eradication of the White Rose's roots. On February 24, 1943, a day after the executions, as the streets still echoed with the sound of distant artillery, the Gestapo apprehended Alexander Schmorl, the surviving corps member, after a desperate attempt to escape abroad. Willy Graf, resisting interrogation with stoic silence, was isolated and denied contact with family or clergy. Professor Kurt Huber, the philosophical voice whose guidance had molded the movement's rhetoric, was charged with treason. Though aged and ailing, Huber refused to recant. In solitary confinement, he penned secret critiques of Nazi truth, smuggling them out with the help of sympathetic guards. Even amidst nightly interrogations, the imprisoned White Rose members would not betray their ideals or each other. Their unity, forged under fire, was unbreakable even as hope flickered. Fear soaked the university, and yet a few new leaves still circulated, only now, the handwriting was disguised, the distribution points carefully hidden. Friends and acquaintances of the fallen members erased addresses, burned notes, and buried memories deep. The net closed tighter. The movement's days were numbered, but its challenge to the regime's absolute power had turned into an irrepressible secret. Justice in the Third Reich, show trials and executions. On April 19, 1943, the surviving White Rose defendants faced their reckoning before Roland Freisler, self-appointed scourge of German traitors. The trial, staged for spectacle and intimidation, dragged Alexander Schmorl, Willy Graf, and Professor Huber before the People's Court. Freisler's shouting crashed through the proceedings, his rage nearly unhinged, enemy of the people. Cowardly agitator. Yet the accused listened in silence, their dignity drawing a tense hush throughout the courtroom. Professor Huber, frail but resolute, declared, "Where there is no justice, resistance is a duty." His words etched into the minds of even his tormentors. Schmorl gazed bravely into the court, refusing to denounce his friends or philosophy. Willy Graf, gaunt but upright, declared that the people's silence cannot last forever. Their conduct, so fearless, reportedly unsettled even hardened party members forced to witness the charade. The inevitable verdict, death for all three. Appeals for clemency were denied, no quarter for those who challenged the mythos of the Reich. Within weeks, the executions were carried out, Schmorl beheaded in July, Huber in the same grim prison that had claimed Sophie and Hans, Graf, only in October, after months of grueling imprisonment and failed attempts by authorities to wring names of more conspirators from his lips. By late 1943, the original White Rose had been extinguished in blood, but the regime could not silence their message. Seeds in the darkness, the spread of memory. Despite Nazi efforts to erase the movement, the story of the White Rose seeped into the shadows. Prison guards, horrified by the courage they witnessed, whispered stories at home. Cellmates in Stadelheim prison smuggled out reminiscences of Sophie's composure, of Huber's final, ringing declaration. Tiny slips of paper, quotes from the leaflets, copied from memory, passed from hand to hand, across prison walls and barracks, into the hearts of those desperate for a breath of hope. In April and May 1943, a remarkable event occurred. A White Rose leaflet, retrieved and delivered to British hands by secret channels, was duplicated in the millions. Allied aircraft rained them down over German cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, where citizens, under blackout and curfew, found them blowing in alleys, snagged against lampposts, drifting through shattered windows. The pamphlet spoke in Sophie's words, "We are your guilty conscience." It was a blow sharper than Allied bombs, a reminder that even behind the front lines, resistance still lived. In at least one case, a Gestapo chief, shaken by whispered stories of Sophie's bravery, reportedly gave his own daughter her name for a memory, should conscience be needed in dark times. These memories, suppressed but indomitable, could not be crushed. They took root in the unlikeliest of places, the hearts of strangers, the dreams of children, the codes of future dissidents. The longest echo, the White Rose legacy in war and memory. Spring turned to summer, and the war ground on with mounting catastrophe for Germany, defeat at Kursk, increasing Allied air raids, whispers of coming reckoning. The names Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl, Alexander Schmorl, Willy Graf, Kurt Huber, Christoph Probst, however, faded not. Surviving friends committed to memory the details of clandestine meetings, the thrill of danger, the light in Sophie's eyes as she defied the machinery of death. In secret, students vowed never again to allow their nation to be governed without a conscience. When liberation finally came in 1945, battered survivors and returning soldiers began collecting the fragments, letters, photos, copies of the 6 leaflets. Munich students, in the war's ashes, placed a white rose at the university entrance every February 22nd. In classrooms ravaged by bombing, new teachers recited Sophie's words as warnings to their students: stand up for what you believe, no matter the cost. The world, too, learned their names. The white rose became a symbol, revered in Germany and abroad, as a light of resistance in a night otherwise defined by terror. Their story endures, spoken into the future by those who, faced by injustice, remember the courage of students who dared to think and act, who chose freedom's suffering over tyranny's comfort. In that choice, their legend became immortal. Post-war reckoning, revealing the truth, 1945 to 1946. The gunfire and bombardment of Allied armies finally reached Munich in April 1945. Within weeks, American troops liberated the city and universities, exposing the horrors of the Third Reich with unflinching clarity. In the face of such overwhelming revelation, a frantic search began. Who had resisted? Who had truly dared oppose Hitler? Allied investigators uncovered the White Rose's secret archive, confiscated typewriters, fragments of pamphlets, forbidden letters stashed in Gestapo vaults. American officers pieced together the timeline: anonymous student protests, a shower of leaflets, a swift, merciless purge. When they interviewed surviving professors and students, the stories of Sophie Scholl and her friends spilled forth, often in bursts of grief and awe. The courage of the White Rose became a subject of urgent inquiry for the denazification tribunals, who sought to distinguish between Germany's complicit majority and its brave, if few, dissidents. Newspapers across the free world published features headlined Munich's martyrs, shining a piercing light onto those who had sacrificed everything for conscience. Allies organized public tributes and issued posthumous pardons. Former Gestapo informants, who once hunted the Scholls, now cowered in the face of vengeful justice. At Ludwig Maximilian University, students swore never again to let silence breed tyranny. Slowly, but with determination, the truth of the White Rose, its fury and its heartbreak, spread across both a shattered continent and a world hungry for clearer lines of right and wrong. Memorial and reflection, Germany confronts its past. The burden of guilt weighed heavily on post-war Germany, yet hope found a symbol in the story of the White Rose. By 1946, a memorial committee, composed of former resistance members, survivors, and Allied administrators, agreed to dedicate a plaque in the university's entrance hall. Their spirit lives on, it read in stark bronze script. Flowers, especially white roses, were left there in quiet, trembling hands, some from former classmates, some from strangers who sought redemption for a nation. The new German press featured stories not only of the Scholls' last stand but of the quiet defiance that pervaded the prison and even touched a few of their guards. Teachers, once bound by Nazi curriculums, now taught the White Rose's leaflets and Sophie's statements in literature and philosophy courses. Her words, "Stand up for what you believe," blossomed in the minds of a new, chastened generation. Meanwhile, city after city named schools and squares after Sophie Scholl, Hans, and the others: the White Rose Gymnasium in Hamburg, Sophie Schollplatz in Munich. A movement born in terror became Germany's new compass, shaping not just legacy, but the very spirit of a democratic rebirth. The White Rose, once scattered and imperiled, now flourished, its petals turned toward the future. The Echo in Cold War Shadows, 1947-1960s. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe and a new era of global suspicion dawned, the legend of the White Rose took on renewed urgency. In partitioned Germany, Sophie's story was quietly celebrated in the West and forbidden in the East, but smuggled copies of her leaflets and biographies found their way to Prague, Budapest, and even Moscow. Young Czechs and Hungarians copied her writings, and the defiant hope of the White Rose crackled beneath the heavy surface of communist oppression, becoming part of a broader, clandestine call to resistance. In America and Britain, universities memorialized the movement in lectures, theater, and literature. The White Rose's pamphlets were studied as blueprints for nonviolent resistance, their phrases cited in the sermons of Martin Luther King, Jr., and other civil rights activists. "You are the conscience of your nation." The Scholl's photos, once police evidence, became icons, symbols that resistance was always possible, even against the darkest regimes. The White Rose itself became a badge for students, reformers, and rebels, an emblem of peaceful defiance wielded against all forms of totalitarianism. Films, books, and plays, translated worldwide, spread their message. In South Africa, a teacher facing apartheid found solace in Sophie's calm, knowing others too had faced the machine of death and remained unbroken. The White Rose resonated wherever conscience demanded to be heard. Conscience and courage, the White Rose in new generations. By the 1970s and into the 21st century, the legacy of the White Rose continued to shape the German conscience and inspire international movements. Survivors shared their memories in classrooms, at memorials, and through foundation work. The story evolved from secret shame to public pride, woven into Germany's post-war identity, not as a nation untouched by evil, but as a country redeemed by those willing to stand up to it. Students bore white roses during democracy protests on both sides of the Berlin Wall in the 1980s. In 1982, on the 40th anniversary of the first leaflet, Munich was awash in flowers, processions, and quiet reading circles, children as young as Sophie had been, holding her image, reciting her words. The White Rose became part of the official curriculum. Hans and Sophie's legacy defined what never again meant to post-war generations. Across the world, dissident creators, filmmakers, poets, and artists invoked the White Rose in their own struggles against apartheid and Tiananmen Square, in the streets of Tehran and Kiev. Their message was simple but deep: stand for what is true, even if you stand alone. Each generation found new ways to carry the spirit of the White Rose, petals scattered anew by winds of change. Immortal memory, the White Rose today and forever. Standing on the cobblestones outside Ludwig Maximilian University, one finds a circle inlaid with bronze leaflets, each a copy of those scattered courageously by Sophie and Hans Scholl in February 1943. Here, every February 22nd, the young and old gather to read her leaflets aloud, to leave white roses, to pass the flame of conscience from one hand to another. In classrooms, theaters, and online forums, their example endures, undiminished by time. The White Rose exists today in every act of peaceful dissent: the student who refuses unjust silence, the teacher who preserves banned books, the writer who tells a forbidden truth. When regimes fall and suffering seems unending, the memory of Sophie, walking calmly to her fate, refusing to betray a friend, letting leaflets fall like snow over tyranny, serves as a bright, eternal promise. The final lesson of the White Rose is not grief, but hope, that even in a world held captive by fear, the smallest voice can awaken a sleeping conscience, and the briefest blossom can endure beyond empires. Sophie Scholl and the White Rose live wherever humanity chooses truth over terror, and the petals of their courage whisper through history's long, haunted night.